verse 9, for the commandments, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Is Paul specifically talking about the 10 commandments? Is he limiting this to, when he says any other commandment, is he limiting that to the 10?
I won't think
No,
so. Yeah. I mean, we can expand, but I mean, nowhere in the scriptures does it say, hey, you just need to do these, and that's how you love your neighbor.
Well, why do you think he picked these specific commandments to talk about instead of build a parapet around your roof?
because
Maybe.
they're
Go ahead.
they're categories of um groups of laws that he's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jules, what's your thoughts?
Well, I'll try to say this. Oh, let me lower my hand. I will try to say this as quickly as I can. I get annoyed, and I think you probably recognize me on X Space when it comes to commentary. I get annoyed when it says we don't follow the law. We're not under the law, and I'm not even convinced. And I'll be as quick as I can to say this. And again, I go back to Matthew chapter 5. I'm pretty sure, in some ways, Paul is trying to attach himself in some manner, in some way, onto this. I'm not even convinced that we should not be. We should be careful not to avoid the other 603 commandments. There's a terminology in Hebrew, Paul Homer, the minor commandments to the minor commandments, so the minor to the greater commandments, Paul Homer. And you think about, and even the Bible study students and the teachers of that day, they were always wondering what was the most minuscule commandment to keep of all the 613 commandments. And it was about, I think it's in Deuteronomy 22. I'm not sure exactly where. Talks about when you try to grab an egg from a mother bird, make sure the mother bird is not watching you taking that egg from her. Make sure she's at not of an eye shot, so would not, because it would bring great grief to her. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because how can that end? How can that desire that you have such a wonderful understanding of God's guidance and instruction direction, and that minor commandment of not taking that egg from a mother hen and or mother bird, making sure you do not try to even bring grievance to that mother bird, that should be in your heart. That could never end. That should never come to an end. So when I'm thinking about Matthew chapter 5, when I'm seeing this in these two verses, I'm seeing Matthew chapter 5 really intensifying in my point of view. We need to be very careful. It says, oh, I don't follow commandments. I think you need a better attitude. Our relationship to the commandments, the 602 commandments, our relation to those commandments are different. They have to be. But our attitude should be the same as Jesus and Moses. That's my point.
Yeah, I agree. And he taught obedience to all the commandments in Matthew 5, 17, when he says, I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And then, not the smallest letter or stroke will pass. And anyone who does and teaches all of these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And yeah, Paul definitely seems to be echoing that. And it could actually be a deliberate reference to that. I have heard people say that because Paul only quotes some of the 10 commandments here, that's what he had in mind when he says any other commandment. He's really only talking about those 10. But then he quotes, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which is not one of the 10. And he says that all of these others are summed up in this one. But when he says that, he's quoting from Leviticus 19:18. 19:18. And let me bring that over on the screen. You can see this. And this is in the context of how do you treat your neighbor? Don't hate the guy who lives next door. Don't hate your fellow countrymen. Don't commit don't bear false witness, which is one of the 10. But then he says, don't take vengeance. Don't bear a grudge against one of your people. Well, that's not in the 10. But it says, don't bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So loving your neighbor as yourself is part of, or rather not bearing a grudge against people is part of loving your neighbor. So if loving your neighbor sums up the 10 commandments, then the 10 commandments must also include, don't bear a grudge against your people. Don't take vengeance. And if you keep reading here, this is all about sexual sins, idolatry, all of the things that people do against each other. And, I think we've talked about this before, but you can look at what Yeshua called the great commandment. You'll love the Lord your God. And then the second one, you will love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if you love God with everything you are, then you will love your neighbor because your neighbor is a creation of God and bears his image. And if you love your neighbor and you love God, you won't bow down to idols. You will keep the Sabbath because this is a special day for both God and your neighbor. You will honor your parents because they created you in partnership with God and they also bear God's image. You will not bear a grudge. You will not commit sexual sins because all of these things are about loving God and loving your neighbor. Any commandment there is includes every commandment there is, and not just the 10, because they are all summed up in the 10, and the 10 is summed up in the one, which is summed up in the other one. You can't have any of them without all of the others.